So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name's Jolynn Bernard, and I am the Director of Educational Partnerships here in Florida. And I'm actually located in St. Augustine, which has been very, very rainy today, which I'm sure many of you are experiencing similar weather. I'm here with my colleague, Trisha, who is also in a New Smyrna Beach rainy area today. But we're so thankful that you're joining us, and we'll both be co-facilitating the session today. And I know that many of you had an opportunity to join us last week as we focused on really how SIPPS can be utilized to accelerate student learning, and especially as we consider the power of SIPPS for students that potentially could have been, out of school, out of one-on-one teaching or small group instruction for several months. And so last week we really honed in on how we could consider our resources, our time, and who might provide that instruction, considering our master schedules, and all of those types of things to provide the most support for our students. When we might give the placement test, who might do that. And today, this session is really focused more on the specifics of SIPPS. The SIPPS levels, what the components are, what the materials are. And so we're just glad that you're able to join us. We will record our session and share the PowerPoint slides with you, along with all the other resources that we talk about today. Anything else to add there, Trisha, before we jump in?
Nope, just, well, I guess a little, but just that I think if we're thinking about you really getting ready, the who, to teach or to help others get ready to teach, we think this is just like a first little snippet that might help with that and give you something to start thinking about, digging into as you think about how you might be teaching sometime in the future. And thanks for joining.
Yes, thank you. So our session today, as I just mentioned, we'll become familiar with the SIPPS program. We'll talk about the elements of SIPPS instruction, the instructional routines, and also explore some of the resources to support you with preparing and implementing SIPPS. Okay, so of course we're going to get started just by kind of grounding ourselves in the definition. What is SIPPS? So you can see here the different SIPPS levels, and we'll talk about each of those throughout our session today. But as we know, that SIPPS is that differentiated foundational skills program that develops word recognition strategies and skills that enable students to become those fluent and confident readers and writers. So it's very systematic and explicit. And our goal is that students will develop as those independent fluent readers who read with accuracy and who read with automaticity. And so all the work that we're doing in SIPPS is in service of those independent fluent readers. And so to kind of situate us in really thinking about this foundational skills instruction, we just wanted to spend a moment really focusing in on the elements of high quality foundational skills instruction. This came out from an ILA literacy brief that talked about these key components, which are all addressed within the SIPPS program. So we'll talk through and consider the systematic scope and sequence, which is really building across a level and across each curriculum or each level of SIPPS. The differentiated instruction that we're really teaching students at their point of need. The lessons are very structured so that students can really spend their time focused in on the learning because they have that predictable structure. And through those explicit and systematic instructional routines, students are really learning to train their brains so that they can apply these skills in the text that they're engaging in. And of course, using that assessment to make those really critical instructional decisions, and then making sure that we are mastering the content so that we can continue on and build upon our learning. And so we'll ground some of the conversations in these elements of high quality foundational skills instruction. And so to start with that systematic and explicit scope and sequence, we know that Dr. Scheffelbein, who developed the scope and sequence and curriculum for SIPPS, really honed in on the foundational skills of phonological awareness, spelling sounds, and high frequency words. And we're building upon that across each and every lesson. And then having opportunities to review and reteach and also assess for mastery. And as we're thinking about that intentional design around that systematic scope and sequence, we can really support students with their growth as readers who are reading with fluency and accuracy. And so taking a look here at just this quick snapshot, and we'll share this with you as well, just this one kind of PDF of the SIPPS graphic. This really helps us to see the different levels. And so I'm just gonna spend one moment sharing with you a little bit about each of the levels. So as you take a look here at the SIPPS beginning level, starting with that simple alphabetic phase, and I'm seeing just to one quick second in the chat, is my chat screen like showing up for everyone or in the way?
I think mine was, but is it still there now?
No, I don't see it.
It was before, I think. So
okay.
Somebody let me know in the chat box if it is, but I think I was sharing the wrong way. So the chat box was covering for people.
Okay, and of course I can't always see the chat when we're talking too, so I'll make sure to stop and take a look at that. As we start just really focusing in on the SIPPS beginning level, so we think about SIPPS beginning, it's really designed for K foundational skills. So the foundational skills standards that students should master in kindergarten are addressed in the SIPPS beginning level, which is really focused on that simple alphabetic phase. So blending and segmentation, consonants, consonant digraphs, and then high frequency words. And so when we think about the SIPPS beginning level, oftentimes we can have students mid to end of the year in kindergarten, and also thinking about sometimes our first grade students that may need support back at the SIPPS beginning level. And so when we think about beginning, another key indicator with all the levels is that students are placed at their point of need. And so in order to enter into the beginning level, one of the key things that we're looking for is that students have mastered 21 letter names, that they have the recognition of 21 letter names to enter into this instruction that occurs within beginning. And so oftentimes we'll start with learning letter names instruction prior to moving into that beginning level. And then moving into and building across into the extension level, extension focuses in on those first grade foundational skills standards. However, with that being said, sometimes we'll have our second grade students, of course, that may need to be placed back in extension level to receive the instruction that they need to master those missing standards that they may have, those gaps that they potentially could have. And in the extension level, we're focused in on segmentation and manipulation, blends, those long complex vowels and final E and flexional endings, and then building into 2-syllable decoding, and also introducing some irregular sight words. And so what you'll notice is that the phonological awareness components, the phonics components, are really moving at an accelerated pace here, and really more, I guess, rigorous as you could think about building across from the beginning level to extension level. And again, students are placed at their point of need, and those mastery tests are built within. As we move across to the top of this chart is SIPPS challenge level. So challenge is really moving into more of a word study approach. So we start thinking about the syllable patterns, the open and closed syllables, those consonant and vowel patterns. We start teaching students when one vowel is at the end, it's long, and when it's not at the end, it's short, and then moving to those morphological units, thinking about prefixes, suffixes, and roots. And so in SIPPS challenge, students actually place at the beginning of that level and move across the complete level. And the way that we differentiate in SIPPS challenge is through the word lists. So those word lists are designed for really supporting students at the different grade levels from second grade on, based on their listening vocabulary. And so we can provide some more context around the SIPPS challenge level as we continue our discussion today. And I just wanted to spend a moment as you look at the little yellow section for SIPPS Plus. You can see that SIPPS Plus isn't really a complete separate level. It does have its own binder, but it's really taking and considering the scope and sequence from the beginning level and extension level, and really accelerating that growth at a more appropriate pace for our students that may be reading back at early first grade level, for example, but are in grades 4 through 12. And so you can see it's really addressing those same standards that are addressed in beginning and extension, but it's considered SIPPS Plus, which is for our 4th through 12th grade students. More appropriate pace and more appropriate engagement with the text that's provided, which we'll share with you in a moment too. And I think the most important thing, and one of the things that I have really found to set SIPPS apart from any other kind of intervention or foundational skills support, is that fluency practice. That students are learning, they're practicing, and then they're applying each and every day. And I think that's what really supports students with that accelerated growth as well, that they're really having an opportunity within every lesson to apply within that fluency practice. So I know that's a ton of information. I just want to pause for a moment. And Trisha, I just wanted to see what else you would add around the SIPPS levels, and then also spend a moment just to see if anybody has any questions as I gave kind of a brief explanation about each of those levels.
So the only thing I would add on to is around that idea of acceleration. The makeup of the lesson, the application to text allows the learning to really accelerate. And I think sometimes having the specific numbers is helpful. If we think about SIPPS beginning, which is where those case standards are, like Jolynn said, there's 55 lessons at most that a student would need to kind of close that gap. So if you think about a first grader, we want them to learn the first grade foundational skills, but if they're back at the beginning of K, they have a lot to do in that time. And so if they were in SIPPS beginning, you're thinking at most 55 lessons to close that gap. And then you have within SIPPS extension around 40 lessons at most to complete that level. So if you think about a first grader that might be a whole year behind, they have the potential to really close that gap across the year with 55 lessons in beginning and 40 in extension. And when we think about our older students in SIPPS Plus, they can close those gaps that they may have from kindergarten, first grade, early second grade within 55 lessons within Plus. So there's only 55 lessons here at most, depending where they place. And so you can really see where we're not just meeting students where they are, but we're also accelerating that learning so we can actually close those gaps and get them back where they need to be. So I just wanted to kind of some of those specifics.
Yeah. Thank you, Trisha. And I think that, continue to put questions in the chat box, and we'll make sure if we don't get to those right in the moment, that we will spend some time at the end reviewing some of the questions and making sure to have that time and space to answer any of those questions as well.
And before we go on, I just want to kind of address those too, because I think they're quick. Okay. Is the SIPPS beginning program appropriate for kindergarten students starting in the middle of the year after they've learned the 21 letter names? Yes. And so we just always, it's not, when we think about intervention for kindergarten students, people don't often think about whether a student might need SIPPS till usually the springtime anyways, because we want them to have access to what they're learning in the core, have that opportunity, and then they might, in the spring, if they're just getting ready for letter sounds, SIPPS would be a great intervention. But if you're thinking about kind of for their instruction, yes, middle of the year, if they know those 21 letters, SIPPS instruction, beginning instruction would be appropriate. Anything you want to add to that, Jolynn?
Yeah, and I think it does depend, as you think about your students, think about the SIPPS placement test, what would be appropriate for them and the timing of that. And then also thinking about, are you using SIPPS as your core tier 1 in that situation, or are you layering it in addition to a core piece? So, and we are happy to come alongside. I know many people, many schools implement SIPPS in many, many different ways based on their student population, who's available to teach SIPPS, all of those types of things. So we are happy to, get on a call with you specifically to answer any questions or email and those types of things in the different situations as those come up for you too.
Yep. And the other question was, is it one lesson a day realistically? Yes, once you get used to the routines, which we're going to talk about, once you, as the teacher and then the students get used to the routines, lessons are about 30 minutes. And so as long as you have that kind of block for your intervention or instruction, depending, then yes, that would be the ideal, especially for intervention. If we're thinking about closing gaps for kids, we want to get to a place where we're in one lesson a day, and being able to meet with the students several times a week, 3, 4, 5 times a week.
Yeah, and as you mentioned that, yes, 30 minutes when you get comfortable with teaching the lessons and the students know, but definitely as you start, giving yourself some grace to know, hey, I'm learning these routines. You might get through, half of a lesson within those 30 minutes the first day, and you just sticky note it and continue on the next day. But then with the goal over those, initial weeks that you hone it into the 30 minutes completely a day, because you're really learning those routines. You're teaching them explicitly and as intended, not adding a lot of additional teacher talk and those types of things to provide that support for your students. And then, that predictable structure and routine is not only helpful for our students, but it's also helpful for us as instructors as well. Okay.
I think we're good.
So as we take a look here at the SIPPS beginning level, you can see one of the things that we wanted to include this slide was really to provide that support around the little blue books. So you can notice in this picture, these little blue books that come with each lesson. So every lesson comes with, I believe is it 6 of the little blue books per lesson. So you have available for your students. You also have PDFs of every one of those stories, and they're also within the story charts. So they have practice reading those story charts together. You can make a reproducible of that if you wanted to send that home with students, and then you also have those little blue books for the practice. In addition to that, you see the sound cards and the sight word cards, and then the sound wall cards. So you're using a lot of these resources within the lesson to support students with also using those resources. And so there's lots of supports there, on the back of the cards. It's really helpful. I find, especially with the letter sounds, it gives you a little example of a sentence. It gives you information if it's a stop sound or a continuous sound to really support us with that continuous blending instruction. And so a lot of those teacher supports are embedded within the resources. And then of course you have that big binder that has every one of the lessons. You can take those lessons out and put all those materials together to make it work really well for your organization of the materials for the daily lessons. And then as we move through to its SIPPS extension level, instead of the little blue books, what we call them, now we move into the story books. So in extension, it's more of transitioning almost to like a chapter book type feel as the students learn and then apply within the storybook. That very intentional design within SIPPS level is that when students get to lesson 23, they're transitioning from the storybook into easy to read trade books. So our goal is that we're moving out of that controlled text for students, and then they're applying it into the easy to read trade books that they're engaging in as well. And do you want to add anything to that, Tricia, around extension?
No, I just think that the picture of the little blue books, and then the storybook sums up what another thing that's amazing about SIPPS, which is that it naturally really progresses with students based on where they would be developmentally as readers at that point. So thinking about the simplicity that a student within beginning would really need, and then what sophistication comes with as you're kind of moving into extension, and then even across extension into those trade books. And all of that is so intentional within SIPPS. And I just think that the books are a really good example of that. But you also find that same kind of like perfect scaffolding and perfect release to independence across the lessons and the routines as well. I just think that's a nice visual on it.
Yeah, and I do, if we were sitting together, doing this session, we would definitely have some of the little blue books and the storybooks out, because I think one of the nice things, and if you have the materials available to you, is just taking some of the little blue books from, lesson 1, 10, 20, all the way up to 55, and looking at the growth of what students are progressing as readers across the SIPPS beginning level, and then moving into the storybooks and doing the very similar thing. And the students are excited because when they get to these texts, they are successful because they've learned all of this in the lesson, and then they're applying it right into those texts. So even as students engage with the little blue books every day, and then reviewing those and moving into the storybooks. I mentioned to you that the little blue books are PDFs that are available to you on our digital platform, and the same with the storybooks. There's a PDF of every single one of those stories from each day that can be utilized for additional practice. If you're able to send those home, oftentimes you might be engaging in parent conferences and wanted to share a copy for parents to practice with their children at home, and for them to just showcase the work that they're doing and be excited about the text that they're reading. Those are available to you too. And then we'll take a look here at Plus. And I know that Tricia and I both taught groups of students in Plus when I first started learning about SIPPS, and had a group of 4th grade students that I was engaging in Plus instruction with. The Dreams on Wheels book really was just a game changer for the students, and I continue to see that with our older students all the time. They love the Dreams on Wheels book because, again, they're successful. And of course, when we showed you that graphic earlier, and Plus was just kind of that little section, we know that we couldn't put our 4th graders, our 8th graders in the little blue books. They would completely be, unengaged in having those little blue books in front of them. But these Dreams on Wheels books are really high interest, but low readability. They're still successful reading them. And honestly, when they're finished with Dreams on Wheels, they're like, where's Dreams on Wheels 2? Like, they want the next piece because they feel so comfortable and confident and successful. And it's almost like a shift for some of our students that could potentially be those students we know that walk around school with the biggest chapter book, but may not have really engaged in reading that. And then they really can see themselves as readers in Dreams on Wheels. Do you want to add anything there too, Tricia?
I think you summed it up, but just that I do think that's the game changer. We know the application is so important, but getting the students to take that application seriously and to want to go beyond the lesson is huge. And so students are not embarrassed to hold this book during the lesson or back in their seats later in the day. I've watched kids sneak it out of the building because they want to take it home. The topics are interesting to older readers, but also often these are the students that haven't been engaged because they really can't read and understand what has perhaps been put in front of them. And so now that they're able to, there's an excitement. And I just think it's that and the acceleration across that. When I think about my 5th grade students, I had 2 in my last year that were level 1s on FSA. And then not even getting through challenge, just getting started with Plus was such a game changer for them, not only with what they know, but how they approached reading as they learned. And both of those students were able to go to a 3 on FSA, which was such a leap for them, their first time being proficient. And I think it's because this really unlocked reading for them. They really struggled. And this was finally instruction that unlocked that reading for them. And part of that is that text.
Yeah, and I do think it not only impacts their reading, but it really impacts their approach across the day in a variety of ways. So that is the Plus section. And then really thinking about SIPPS Challenge, you can notice it's a little different. As we look at SIPPS Challenge, we're moving away from the controlled text. So students that place here are engaged in just write text for them. So really thinking about what would be an appropriate text for them to engage in. And so we're teaching the lessons, and then they're still applying within a variety of texts. So if you think about in the SIPPS Challenge level, we're really learning about being flexible with our reading as we think about all the schwa sounds and dividing by syllables. And so we're really learning those word learning strategies, and students shift from sight words to sight syllables. And I think that's such a huge piece, because in SIPPS Challenge, you're not only learning about the site syllable that can often make up multiple words, you're also learning the vocabulary. What does that site syllable mean? Like viz, to see, or if we're doing like transport, transportation, like all of those different ways, we're increasing their vocabularies at the same time as we're teaching those site syllables. And then as we really think about all of these different levels and really finding their point of need, we want to consider that we're not just starting everyone at the same place, but we're spending time giving that placement test to find out where their instructional point of need is. And so, Trisha, I'm just going to ask you if you could spend some time talking a little bit about that placement assessment. Oh, I think you're muted.
I am. I had so many good things to say just then. When I think about the power of that placement assessment, I think about how it allows us and helps us to differentiate and create small groups that meet students at their point of need. And it always takes me back to the ability to accelerate also. So it's just so powerful. There are 2 placement assessments. There is a placement assessment for students in grades K through 3, and a separate one for students in 4th through 12th grade. And that's really just because, as Jolynn shared as she was going through that visual, students in K3, dependent upon their need, would place into beginning, extension, or challenge. And for students in 4 through 12, it would be plus or challenge. So the tests look very, very similar. If you end up being charged with giving both of these, they're very similar. It's just that placement consideration that's different. And another important thing I want to point out when we think about acceleration is that it doesn't only place students right at the level where they need instruction, but down to the lesson, except for with challenge where they would start at 1. It places them exactly to the lesson. So if I have a first grader who has K needs, I don't want them to start at beginning 1 if they don't need that. Perhaps there's just the chunk towards the end, or the more complicated standards that they need. And so I would love for them just to be able to get what they need in 20, 24 lessons. But I just think the placement within the level is so important. Within the SIPPS placement assessment, which can be found in the appendices of your manual, but also on our digital platform, there is support for giving the placement assessment. That way, if you're charged with giving it or charged with training others to give it, you can do that in a really consistent way. And then within the placement assessment itself, there is a lot of support for placing students. So after each chunk of the placement assessment that you give, and we will send a link to so that you can access the placement assessment as well as a lesson. But after each section of the placement assessment, there's guidance for if the student passes phonics, you would continue on to the next section. And if not, there's placement guidance. And there's even specific placement guidance for our younger students in K and 1 and our older students in 2 and 3, 2nd and 3rd grade. So students that might have the same needs, we do want to try to place them in extension level review lessons if they're in 2nd or 3rd grade. And there's 15 lessons designed to really, at a little bit of a faster pace, but support some of those gaps that our older students might have that come from those K foundation, and then really get them started with first. But there's support. If the student's struggling too much, consider placing them back at beginning based on what you see in those first 5 lessons. What would you add about the placement assessment, Jolynn?
I think really just reiterating that the guidance on the placement assessment is so helpful with making those decisions about where they might place. And I also think that, typically it only takes, 5 to 7 minutes as you give the placement assessment. And so we talked about this in our last session last week, is that you may be considering, as you look ahead to this upcoming school year, lots of different things. But one of the things that we typically recommend is that we wait several weeks into the school year to administer the placement test, because we want students to be reactivated to school and reactivating their thinking and readjusting to being back in school. And so what we've decided, though, with all of our colleagues and really thinking about just the different situation that we're in this year, is that we are recommending giving the placement test sooner. because we know that there's such a need for that acceleration. And so some of the things that we'll share with you around, we've been thinking a lot about the remote learning, and I know there was a question about that, and we'll talk a little bit about that today too. But just some different considerations about when you might give the placement test. You know, if you have time, and one of the links that we'll share with the follow-up Tricia mentioned, we'll give you a link to access the placement assessment, and there's guidance on exactly how to give it, what it looks like, the wait time in the different sections. So all of that is really supportive for us. And I think that's the case for all of our work, that there's tons of guidance embedded within the curriculum and the lessons to support us with delivery of instruction, delivery of assessments, and making all of those instructional decisions along the way to really support our students. So.
And I just think about the guidance that's there for giving this in the normal setting. I still think, and I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to get a chance to help some of my friends at the school I used to work at to give some of these placement assessments virtually. I can see that happening. I haven't had the opportunity yet, but I look forward to it. But I can see using some of the resources on our digital platform, perhaps on your screen, and then being able to give this digitally. I would always prefer to give it in person, but I think that there's that guidance. If you just kind of put that shift in your mind, you could make it apply for a remote setting as well. So another element that we think is really important within SIPPS, the elements of that high quality foundational instruction, is the structured lessons. So Jolynn has touched on this a bit, but the lessons are structured in a way that it really supports students being able to do the work and to tune in for the work that they have to do. So in every single lesson across all of the levels, though challenge is a little bit different, but across beginning, extension, and plus, every lesson starts with phonological awareness, which leads into phonics, where students are reviewing sounds in every lesson and learning new sounds in some of the lessons. They also have a chance to apply that within a little bit of a small list of words that they can practice on in that kind of isolated way. And then a chance for them to review sight words they previously learned and learn new ones. And so then if we think about each of those parts, those instructional routines or those parts of the lessons then lead into the chance to apply in every single lesson. So they use that phonics and sight word knowledge as they have a chance to spell during guided spelling or write. And then a chance to read the text, the connected text that's made up of the sight words they've learned and the sounds they've learned. They have a chance to apply that with some support, and then also a little more independently with every single lesson. So the fact that every lesson, even challenge, is just a little more sophisticated, follows this, is really in support of students being able to do that work and build that knowledge so that the pacing can be fast. Additionally, side note, I think it's really helpful for teachers as we have so much to plan for, and sometimes we might teach many SIPPS lessons across the day. Knowing what to expect is designed to be in support of the students, but it's really helpful for us as the teachers of SIPPS as well. Anything you want to add about the lessons, Jolynn? So in that same vein, we also, SIPPS follows that predictable lesson structure every day, but it's also based on predictable, explicit instructional routines across those lessons. So they're designed to support the students so that they're prepared as what they're learning becomes more complex over time. So we always say that our routines have these elements of high involvement. The routines are clear, consistent, concise, and they are looking for a choral response. So when we think about each of those parts of the lesson that I just showed, phonological awareness, phonics, sight words, guided spelling, and then the reading, each of the routines there is very clear. It's very consistent. Students are using the same routine across multiple days, some of them across the whole level. And the language is very concise. So teachers' language is very minimized so that the time can be spent with the students doing the work, they're responding chorally, and so that we can keep up that pacing that we speak of. Across the entire lesson, students are doing the work the whole time, They're answering in a choral response so that every student has to do the work across the whole lesson. And there are within these routines verbal cues, and we use our finger for a cue so that students are learning. We don't want you to be the first one to answer. We really want you to all think and then answer when given the cue so that everyone is responsible for that work across the whole lesson. During the guided spelling, all students are writing and doing that work. And during the reading portion of the lesson, the students are all doing that work. Again, at one point with some support, but then at another point, they're all doing that individually with the teacher checking in. Did you unmute, Jolene? Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know we will share where you can see like full examples of videos of lessons being taught. So you can see exactly what those routines look like. But I do think those clear, consistent, concise, and choral responses can feel a little different than what we're used to. But I always think about, it's not about me as the teacher. It's really about what is the best way to provide this instruction to students so that they have that transfer to their learning. And so we think about this as those elements of high involvement, that we're teaching these as intended for that intended outcome for our students. And so I think that's a big kind of shift in our approach, because sometimes we think, no, I'm going to call in the different students and I'm going to add a lot of additional teacher talk, but really we want to be clear, concise, consistent, and have that choral response.
And I think this is one of the most important slides, because as you perhaps are new to teaching SIPPS, it does cause us to shift our practice. And without knowing the why and how important it is, it's very easy, especially if you come with a big bag of tricks for foundational skills, it's very easy to just kind of use the materials and perhaps teach the way that you already have. But these routines, as well as that predictable lesson structure, is really, it's research-based. And so if we think about how important it is, it helps if we know the why. So when I think about these routines are designed so that students do the work. So it causes us as teachers to kind of take a step back during much of the lesson and let the students do the work, and then come in a very specific way if there's support needed. And then that support is just enough so that they can get unstuck and do the work themselves. Additionally, the routines help to train the brain. So there's one routine I always talk about in the beginning that I always wanted to change or abandon. It's the way that we have the students read together. It can be tough, especially as you're kind of giving yourself that time to learn. But it's so important, because what I've realized and learned over time is that routine where we're asking students to read or sound, and then we go back and we repeat, and it can be challenging for us as the teacher. It's really designed that way so that students will do that same thing when they engage with text in our small group, but also away from our small group. We want them to look and know that there's certain words we just read if they're sight words, and certain words that we're going to decode and we sound, and we might sound again, and then we're going to read. And then when that sentence is very chunky because we just did all that work, we're going to go back and reread. So it's all very much in training the students how they would approach this work as they're becoming more independent, and causes the students to do the work. So I think, and that's just a little bit of the why, I think knowing the why can help you maybe commit when it's time for you to start teaching to, let me lean in and really take the time to teach it this way, which is how we've seen SIPPS have the greatest impact, is when it's taught as intended, we have the greatest impact. Anything else, Jolene? All right. So thinking about the placement assessment, and then the importance of that lesson structure and those routines. The other thing that helps us to provide SIPPS instruction in the way that's really meaningful is the fact that it's assessment driven. So not only do we have that placement assessment, we have a mastery test that come along the way so that we can see how are students doing with what's been taught. And so those mastery tests come in beginning every 10 lessons. In extension and plus, they're about every 5 lessons, but there are actually points in extension and plus where the work gets tough, and there's a chance to give a mastery test. I think there's a couple places where it comes after 2 and 3 lessons, so that we can really stop, see how students are doing, and then make decisions about reteaching or providing extra support. And in challenge, they come every 10 to 15 to 20. They're kind of at different intervals within challenge, and they're called progress monitors. So it's not so much about mastery within challenge, but really the progress that we see across that level because it's so sophisticated.
I just wanted to add really quick too about making those instructional decisions. And I think that within those mastery tests, and as we, let's say I've been teaching and it comes up with the mastery test time, which we administer to the students, and we can look and see how each of the individual students are doing. We can also look across the assessment and see, okay, all of my students are really struggling with this particular piece. I'm going to look at the scope and sequence, and I'm going to go back to a particular lesson to reteach. Those reteach opportunities, which I think is another just really intentional and supportive piece of the SIPPS program, is that every lesson has an opportunity for reteach in it. So for example, if I'm teaching beginning level lesson 11, I go through that lesson, let's say I'm teaching it today, and I just use list A throughout the whole lesson. And then if I notice my students just really struggled today, or there was some things that happened that I just need to reteach that, I can teach that same exact lesson tomorrow using list B. So those reteach lessons are built into every lesson, and I can use that mastery test data as well as observing my students to know when I might need to slow down or reteach. And so those reteach pieces are built within the beginning, extension, and plus level. And then challenge has those different word lists, as I mentioned before, based on grade levels.
I feel like I had something I wanted to add, but then I read the chat box. So I guess just to add to what Jolynn is saying around those decisions, we think that I always say when people are starting out, to work on your routines and to know that there's a mastery test, you get 2 points. So knowing that there's a mastery test is huge, and then remembering to give it is another whole point. Once you've started doing that, then you're ready to make some decisions based on it, which is really where it's at. SIPPS is very structured and supportive of the teacher, but the teacher is so important. So it's not just teaching the lessons as they're written, it's then using your data to make those decisions. So, and that's where I appreciate the structured lessons, because as I don't have to plan those lessons so deeply, I can really tune into what's happening during the lesson and to what my data tells me and make those decisions. So mastery tests, depending where they come, every 10 lessons or every 5, are noted at the end of the lesson. And so there is a note that looks very much like this at the end of beginning lesson 10 or extension lesson 5, and it reminds you to give that assessment. A lot of times this goes missed because as teachers finish their lesson and they're listening to students read, they don't go back to their manual to go, oh, is there anything on this last page? So this is something to look out for. And there's a lot of other ways to try to remember the mastery test, but it will remind you on that last page of the lesson to give it. But another thing that often goes unnoticed is this support that's there for us after we get our data. After we finish giving our mastery test, which might take 2 minutes, 3 minutes, then we can look at our data and make those decisions like Jolynn said. Do I need to make some decisions for my group? Or are there certain things that I might want to do for certain students or certain parts of the lesson? And so this is not a complete note, but there's all of this support to consider. If most of your students pass phonics and sight words, do this. If not, try this. It will sometimes even direct you to a specific lesson. So it's not that you have to go back 10 lessons. It might tell you to go back to lesson 6 and reteach that, which might be the support that's needed. So I think this is huge, and I didn't see it for a long time because I always stepped away from my manual to listen to my kids read. So this is something to look for, tab, put a big star by, because there is the support for you from the very first mastery assessment. So as we think about assessment, very, very black and white is that mastery assessment, which comes every 5 or 10 lessons. But another chance for us to really verify that instruction, see how our students are doing, comes at the end of every lesson when our students read. And so Jolynn's gonna expand on that.
Okay, so, and I just saw a question. Welcome, Zita. I saw that you had a question about assessing students prior to starting the SIPPS lesson. And so we will share the recording from this whole session with you. But yes, you can definitely give that placement assessment prior to even decide who needs SIPPS and how that's going to look where they place. And then as far as the mastery test, sometimes teachers will just move right into that mastery assessment right after. They might even do the next day of their SIPPS time, have the students reread some of the Dreams on Wheels or their storybooks or little blue books, as they can work one-on-one with each student to quickly administer that mastery assessment. And then of course we may, and we can consider this with our time together today too, that we may be going into a little breakout to do a one-on-one conference with students, even in a virtual setting, to check in on that mastery. So yes, and if there's additional questions, Ida, we'd be happy to help you think through that. And I think that this verification of instruction is so important, that when we're listening and we're coming alongside our students to see their application into text, we're really verifying, are they able to apply what they're learning into the text? And if we need to provide that additional support, we can really see that through our opportunity to come alongside and listen to them as they're engaging in that text. In addition to that, as we shared with you about challenge level, that students are reading in those self-selected texts, so it's no longer that controlled text, because when we think about challenge, they're really reading polysyllabic words, and so we want them to engage in text where they're going to be able to apply the word learning strategies that they've learned in SIPPS Challenge. And so not only are we focusing in on students reading within the SIPPS lesson, we really want to think about their reading across the day. And so before we talk about that, I will just mention here that everything within the SIPPS program, there's not additional consumable pieces. So there are all of the different pieces that come with SIPPS. You can have the PDFs and everything in the digital platform. One of the things that comes with your SIPPS levels or kits is this intensive multisensory instruction for SIPPS. But I just wanted to spend just a moment. So SIPPS in itself is multisensory. And we know that the majority of the students that are engaged within a SIPPS level are successful. They're making that mastery, they're applying within their text. We're reteaching if needed, we're slowing down when it gets tricky. We're really making all of those intentional decisions. But there are times when some students may need some additional support. And so this intensive multisensory instruction handbook also comes along with your materials, and there's also little student copies. There's also PDFs of those on our digital platform, but those could be some of the things that would be a consumable piece, but really everything that you get within your materials is everything that you need. But the multisensory instruction provides some additional supports on some of the routines, such as phonological awareness, the phonics section, sight words, and guided spelling. And so sometimes there might be a need where you provide that additional support, and then over time, we're going to remove that support as well. So that's just another piece. And again, SIPPS as itself is multisensory, so we really want to provide that initial instruction, provide that those mastery tests, look at that assessment information to know what we might reteach, and then know that this is an option as needed as well.
And I would just add that I think though some students will need this level of support, when lessons are taught as intended and the teachers are to the point where they're making those instructional decisions, which I don't think comes all at one point. You have to start teaching, get comfortable with that, and then you're kind of ready to tune in to a little bit more with the instructional decision making. But when those two things are in place, I think that SIPPS takes care of most of your students. But once those are in place, if you've made those decisions and it's not, that's when this comes in handy. But I think it's very rare that it's needed, to be honest.
Okay, and then just really thinking about, this is one component of students' instructional day, and really having lots of opportunities to read across the day. Not only extra practice with reading the texts that are provided within SIPPS, but reading lots of other texts as well. And so we just couldn't spend a session without talking just about the value of reading across the day. Here's some examples of some of the fluency libraries that we have. I know many schools are filled with lots of books. but we do have some additional fluency libraries to enhance some of that as well. But these are some examples of some of the texts students would transition to after lesson 24. They finish that storybook and move into some of these types of trade books. And then also thinking about some of the high-low fluency libraries that are very similar to like the plus types of text that are high interest, low readability texts that provide students with additional practice to engage in applying the strategies that they're learning. Not sure where that little picture's not there, but I'm sure it will pop up as we share the PowerPoint with you.
Yeah, I don't know where that one
I know we're getting so close to our hour, but we wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about preparing for instruction and then share some of the resources that are available in the hub or portal for you.
So ideally, if we were able to be together for 2 or 3 hours, this is where we would then kind of transition to some real application time for you. We do think it's really important to know the what about SIPPS and the why, and this is kind of getting to the how. And so this will just be a very brief tour into things that you might spend some time on after this. So if we think about all that support that's within SIPPS, we've talked about some of them around the placement assessment, around the those routines, but there is additional support all over the place. So within each lesson that students might place into, so if you think about those entry points, beginning 1, 11, 21, 31, those lessons are a lot of pages. They're still just 30 minutes, but there's a lot of pages because it assumes that perhaps you've never taught SIPPS and you're starting in on lesson 21. And so it's very, a lot of support with extra pictures, what the teacher's saying, what the teacher's holding, what the teacher's doing. And that's within those entry points. And then you'll notice like at lesson 23, you're down to a normal amount of pages. Another gem that's at the end of some lessons are instructional self-checks, which are kind of guides that are with you right when you need them. So I might be thinking about different things at beginning lesson 6 than my friend might be if they're teaching lesson 30 something. And so there's a little check-in at the end of certain lessons that just kind of go through a checklist. Like, are you doing this? If not, try this. Are you seeing this? If not, try this. And so support for you right on the side. But when we think about really getting ready to teach, we want to go back and think about the importance of teaching the lessons as they're intended, following the order of the lesson, teaching all parts of the lesson, unless as you're learning, you might take 2 days to do that, but teaching all of the parts and following those routines and teaching them as they're written. That can be the stretch that Jolyn spoke of. Some of the routines feel very different and feel very goofy. And so we have on our digital platform little videos where you can see this. You'll find it within the lesson itself. You'll also find within Appendix A, and I'm trying to change my screen, so give me a second. Within Appendix A, at the back of the lesson, oh geez, let me find all my stuff here. Then you will find all of the routines in that one appendix. But we can also go to our digital platform, and whether it's the hub or the portal for you, and you can see videos of each of the lessons. So I've just clicked on SIPPS extension, and within there, I can go by chunks of lessons, and then I can actually see what the phonological awareness routine might look like. And Jolyn, you'll have to tell me if I have sound when I do this.
Snap. Blend.
Snap.
So when you see, because we'll share these slides with you, but when you see us talk about the routine animations, we're talking about very short clips that are animated that show you exactly what the teacher would be holding, what they would be doing with their finger, what they would be saying, and what the students would be saying. So I could watch this same clip 4 different times to make sure I knew when my voice was on and when it was off, and what I'm doing with my finger and how I'm making those sounds. And so those are here for you for all of those parts of the lesson. So here's the phonological awareness part of lesson 1. Here's the phonics part. Here's the sight word part. Nope, that's the reading a mixed list. Then you have the sight word part and the guided spelling portion. So you can see across the whole lesson what those routines would look like in an animation, except for the reading portion. Another thing you can do if you click on the animations and videos is, if you don't prefer the animation, I can also see a teacher-facing video. So here's a different phonological awareness routine.
Say shop.
Shop.
Sound shop.
Shop.
Say shed.
Shed.
Sound shed.
And so you can see what you're holding, how you're pointing. You can notice what she said, and then when her voice turned off, and how the kids respond chorally. There's so much in these short videos that can help us teach the routines as intended. Some people like to have their manual open in front of them so they can see it in print, and then to be able to go to the hub or the portal and click on these to actually see it in action, I think is an important piece of getting ready. Also at each level, we have a whole video you can watch. So a classroom video that you can watch and see what a lesson might look like. And sometimes the resources are a little different, but you can still see each part of the lesson. And so I know we're very short on time. Let me go back to the PowerPoint, because what we really want to share is a structure that we think is going to be helpful as you prepare to teach. So we think practice is the most important. And so something you might do, and we'll share these slides with you, so it's something you can do on your own or with a friend, is to read the routine in the Appendix A, or even in the lesson itself, and then go on the digital platform, and of each routine, watch the teacher-facing video, watch the animation of the routine. So if I'm at the very beginning of the lesson in the phonological awareness, I can watch that routine as a video and as an animation. If you have a partner, you can practice with a partner, or on your kids, whatever you might want to do to practice those, and start to think, do you feel a little more comfortable? Do you feel like you have this routine? And then go on to the next routine and kind of practice. It's a lot of work up front, but then it becomes very routine, because these routines are very consistent across each of the levels and even into the next level. A very quick shot, because you might want to view this later from the PowerPoint slides, is what do you need to have available when you're teaching the lessons? At each lesson, at each level, there's a sight word dictionary that you want to print or make available to your students digitally, so that they can be independent when they're doing that writing within the lesson and beyond. And then also the sound wall cards. And Jolynn showed those in that original, the materials slides. It's the longer letter sound cards, but you want to have those available if you're teaching in person, or you can even share a digital copy of that for students to have available at home. And then there's just a few other little charts that you might have up depending on your level. We want to very quickly just show you where you can find some of that remote guidance that you guys asked about. And so if we go to the Collaborative Classroom.org webpage, and you go to professional learning, and we'll send this link in the follow-up, then you'll see a button or a place to click for remote learning. And here is our guidance all in one place for remote learning, general and program specific. So you'll find some general guidance, but you can also click right to SIPPS and find all of our SIPPS guidance. We will share about a 14-minute video with you in our follow-up that gives you a tour of that, all of the SIPPS support. So SIPPS is really designed to teach in person, but as we've been going through this, teachers have shared with us what they have been doing that's worked. We've shared resources that have helped them do that work that can be shared with families and students' platforms. And so there's a great, not a great because I made it, but a little tour that you can do to take you through all of those resources, which are great. And the other thing, and then contact us for help as you're doing that. The other thing that we want to show from the Collaborative Classroom page is under events, upcoming institute and webinars. We have 2 more webinars coming up tomorrow and the next day. And tomorrow's on the 27th is kind of a replay of what we did last week. So if you weren't able to join us for our Florida specific webinar on considering how to start the year with SIPPS, here's a national one that will have very much the same content. It's just a little bit of a broader scale. And so you can register to join that. Or we have another webinar as we think a lot about community and the importance of that all the time, but especially this upcoming year. We have a reconnecting with our students and rebuilding our learning communities webinar that you can register for. What would you add, Jolene? Because I know that we are at the end of our time and we want to honor that, but what else might you add?
I just put in the chat box, I know that last week we really focused in on accelerating student learning, kind of big picture. Today is a little bit more specific about the SIPPS levels and materials, and we will share all of this with you for some guidance around what would your next steps potentially be. And we have been scheduling with different schools and districts some additional kind of bigger chunks of time. So if you're leaving here today thinking like I need more time, we have sessions where we've designed for taking groups through lessons, having them explore each of the different components within a lesson, practicing those lessons in those routines for more of a hands-on application piece. So please reach out if that's something that you're finding you're ready for, or your teachers or districts are ready for. We're happy to come alongside and thinking about that as well. And we just are so thankful for all of you that have been able to join us today. If you have to hop off, because I know our time is up, feel free to continue to reach out to us. If you want to stay on and you have any questions, we're happy to do that too. And we just hope that you have something that you're taking away as far as a next step, whether attending some upcoming webinars, practicing some of those routines, utilizing some of those resources. And we will share with you a full recorded webinar that talks through the importance of the lesson structure and instructional routines, which would be another great next step for those of you that are ready for that as well. So thank you all, and feel free to add any of your questions to the chat box. And Tricia, we can add our emails to the chat box too, and we will have our emails as well in the follow-up email that we'll send to you later this week.
And Sarah, I hope you're still on, but I just want to address, because I think it'll be easier if I unmute. But when you ask about I'm trying to go back to your thing, the books or the cards, how can we use them during distance learning? What I have seen some of my colleagues and others around the state do is within that guidance for teachers around SIPPS, we have added resources that didn't used to be a resource for SIPPS. So when you think about the cards that you use within SIPPS, the sight words and the sound cards, those are now available so that if you want to use them, if you're recording lessons or teaching lessons live, you have those available if you don't have yours. But those same things can be shared with families. And so when you think about ways that you might have your students practice beyond a lesson that you might provide, those are there. And what I've seen people do is to put them on whatever platform they're using. So Canvas or Schoolology, like I don't know all of them, but those platforms, people have been able to put, so SIPPS extension, and put resources there. And then with a little support for students and families, guide them to how they might use those resources. During this time, and again, everybody jump off if you have to, we just want to be able to answer any questions. And thank you for joining. But during this time of remote learning, most of our partners have kind of been figuring it out and kind of coming in as like triage. So some people have figured out how to record videos that have been really effective with their students. People have tried teaching those lessons live, and some of those experiences are shared within those SIPPS resources and kind of lessons learned. But others have approached it with, I want to stop and just make sure I'm providing an opportunity for my students to review and reread. They've posted the stories, which Jolene talked about, that we have digital. They've posted those to that same place or printed them and shared them with families. So some people have just provided opportunities for review during this time. But one of the things we think about going forward is that we're not sure what the fall will look like, how much will be in person, or if there'll be a hybrid, or whether we'll be out again. And so we think that people might be thinking about this important instruction a little differently, perhaps prioritizing it, being ready with a plan. And so there are cards that could be shared. There are the books. And I think about, if we come back together in the fall, how important it will be while we have our students to start to try to acclimate them to some of those resources remotely. Though we want to teach the lessons in person, how can we share some of this digital part so that if they have to access them remotely, they're a little more comfortable? Because it is hard, especially if you think about different ages of students, but there's a lot more resources available within those. That was long, but Jolynn, what would you add?
I think that's great. And I think exploring the remote learning page for SIPPS is really helpful. I think your recorded video is actually really helpful too. That just takes you through all of those components. And I know that we've heard from so many different schools and districts that have been implementing SIPPS throughout this time of distance learning in lots of varieties of ways, even recording some of the lessons, putting them on pen drives to share with families. Sometimes they've been able to have small groups within conference type style lessons. And it is different. It is challenging to think about the choral responses and giving back that feedback. But I think knowing, it just really depends on the different situations, whether students were familiar with the routines before, or if it's brand new instruction for them. And so we have lots of ways that we can help provide some considerations and think through varying situations with you as well. And Sarah, please reach out. I see some of your questions here. We are happy to have a call with you too.
So, right, Sarah, there's not SIPPS videos ready to provide for students. One of the things I just referenced there was that we do have teachers that have shared their video recordings of being a reader small group, which somebody brought up in the chat box before. It has a very similar scope and sequence, similar routines, a little bit different, but similar. And so those have been such a great learning experience for me to see what a recorded video might look like if recorded videos is your best option, which is what some of my old colleagues had figured out. But we also in Orange County have had has had a teacher teaching them live, and she's had great things to share. So I think it's, if you haven't tried it, to try and see what works. And also knowing your students are recordings better? Are live lessons possible?